"We were beaten, sir. Mama said you will help." That's how it begins. Two battered children, a promise whispered, and a mountain man who thought his days of standing up were over. But when fists and fear rule a town, and the strong prey on the quiet, one man's choice to help becomes something far greater. He didn't come looking for a fight. But some fights come looking for a man. And when the church bell stops and the wind dies, this town will face a reckoning. Who will stand when every good man's been beaten down? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The bitter wind howled outside Caleb Booker's line shack, rattling the wooden shutters like angry fists against glass. He sat in his favorite chair, boots propped near the hearth's dying embers, when urgent pounding jolted him from his evening peace. "Help, please, mister!" a young voice called through chattering teeth. Caleb grabbed his wool coat and yanked open the heavy door. Two small figures huddled on his porch, their faces half hidden in the shadows. Snow dusted their shoulders like sugar on morning biscuits. "Good Lord," he breathed, ushering them inside. The lamplight revealed their condition: the boy's split lip, the little girl's tear-streaked face, both of them shivering something fierce. "We were beaten, sir," the boy stammered, standing protective in front of his sister. "Mama said you will help." Caleb's throat tightened as he recognized them. "David and Ruthie Greyhawk," he said softly. Sarah's children. The last time he'd seen them was at their father's funeral, nearly 2 years back. "Here now, let's get you warm." He stirred the fire back to life, adding fresh logs until orange flames danced high. "Ruthie, come sit by the heat. David, let me look at that lip." The little girl crept forward, her beaded moccasins leaving wet prints on the plank floor. Her brother remained wary, dark eyes tracking Caleb's every move. "Your mama," Caleb said, reaching for his medical kit. "Where is she?" David's chin quivered. "Sheriff Mace took her, said we was trespassing on county land." His small fists clenched. "But it's our land. Mama has papers." "Hush now," Caleb murmured, dabbing witch hazel on the boy's swollen lip. "Tell me slow from the start." As he tended their hurts, Ruthie's scraped palms, David's bruised cheek, the story spilled out. Sheriff Mace and his deputies had stormed their cabin at sunset, waving eviction papers. When Sarah produced her treaty-granted water deed, Mace had torn it up, claiming Cherokee documents held no weight anymore. "Mama wouldn't back down," David said proudly. "She told him straight out he was breaking the law." Ruthie's soft voice joined in. "Then the mean deputy hit her. She fell hard." Fresh tears welled up. "They dragged her away in chains." Caleb's jaw clenched. He'd known Sarah since they were young, had watched her tend to settlers and natives alike with equal care. The thought of her in Mace's jail made his blood boil. "We hid in the root cellar," David continued. "When they left, we ran. Mama always said if trouble came, find Mr. Booker." He met Caleb's eyes. "Said you owed her from the fever time." The fever time. Caleb's hand stilled on the bandage he was wrapping. 3 winters ago, when influenza had swept through the territory like wildfire, his Emma, 8 months pregnant, burning up despite everything he tried. Sarah riding through a blizzard to reach them, bringing her Cherokee medicines. She'd stayed 4 days, nursing Emma through the worst. They'd lost the baby anyway. Lost Emma too, a month later. But Sarah had given them precious days together. Time for goodbyes. A debt indeed. "You did right coming here," Caleb said gruffly. He fetched bread and cold venison from his stores, watched the children devour it like they hadn't eaten all day. Probably hadn't. Ruthie's eyes grew heavy as she ate. David fought sleep longer, but eventually slumped against his sister. Caleb carried them to his narrow bunk, tucking his thickest quilt around their small forms. Now he sat in his chair, staring into the flames, while the wind mourned outside. 6 miles those children had walked through snow and darkness. Sarah must have been desperate to send them out in such weather, knowing the risk but trusting they'd find safety with him. His quiet life stretched before him like a well-worn trail. Simple, predictable, safe. The path of a man who'd lost too much, who'd chosen solitude over the pain of caring. But Sarah's children slept in his bed, their presence already cracking the walls he'd built around his heart. Caleb reached for his pipe, an old habit when troubled thoughts came calling. The tobacco pouch was empty. He set it aside with a sigh, remembering how Sarah had once scolded him about his smoking. "That stuff'll turn your lungs black as sin," she'd said, mixing herbs for Emma's fever. "My people have better medicine for soothing spirits." The memory tugged at something deep inside him, something he'd thought long buried. A sense of obligation, yes, but more than that. A chance to repay kindness with kindness, to stand against the sort of injustice that had driven him into isolation in the first place. Dawn was still hours away. Outside, coyotes yipped their lonesome songs to the stars. Caleb watched the sleeping children, saw how David's arm curled protective around his sister even in slumber. Such courage in one so young, such trust coming to him in their hour of need. He couldn't fail them, couldn't fail Sarah. Gray dawn crept over the horizon as Caleb hitched his mule to the wagon. The beast's breath rose in white puffs against the winter air. He'd spent the night gathering supplies, extra blankets, dried meat, and a few precious apples he'd been saving for spring. David stood in the doorway, watching Caleb's every move with those cautious, dark eyes. The boy had barely slept, jerking awake at every creak of the cabin's timber. Little Ruthie still dozed inside, curled tight as a rabbit in its burrow. "Your mama," Caleb said, adjusting the harness straps. "She's the strongest woman I know." He glanced at David. "Did she ever tell you about the fever time?" David shook his head, inching closer to the wagon. 3 winters back, when sickness swept through these parts. Caleb's voice grew soft with memory. "My wife Emma was with child, burning up something fierce. Your mama rode through a blizzard to reach us, stayed 4 days, mixing her medicines, singing Cherokee healing songs." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly. "She still sings those songs, when she tends sick folks." "That so?" Caleb smiled, grateful for the tiny crack in David's armor. "Reckon she's helped half the territory by now." Once the wagon was ready, Caleb carried a sleeping Ruthie out, wrapping her in his thickest quilt. David climbed up beside his sister, protective as always. Caleb piled more blankets around them both before taking the reins. The trail to Red Willow Crossing stretched 6 miles through snow-laden countryside. The mule picked its way carefully, hooves crunching through frozen drifts. Morning light painted the white landscape in shades of pearl and rose. "Your mama?" Caleb said after a while. "She delivered the Cooper twins last spring, didn't she?" David nodded. "Ma was gone 3 days. Said they was stubborn as mules about coming into the world." "Sounds about right for Coopers," Caleb chuckled. "Your mama's got patience enough for 10 ordinary folks." As they rode, he shared more stories, how Sarah had splinted Johnny Weber's broken arm, how she'd saved Widow Patterson's prized milk cow. With each tale, David's responses grew longer, his trust building like a warming fire. Ruthie woke as they passed the old silver mine, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Are we going to get Mama?" "That's right, little one," Caleb said gently. "You two stay bundled up now. We're nearly there." Red Willow Crossing appeared through the morning haze, a scatter of wooden buildings hunched against the cold. Smoke rose from chimneys, and a few hardy souls hurried along the boardwalks, collars turned up against the wind. Caleb drew the wagon to a stop behind the general store. "Listen close now," he told the children. "I need you both to stay right here no matter what happens. Can you do that for me?" David's jaw set in a familiar, stubborn line, Sarah's determination shining through. "Yes, sir." The jail squatted at the end of Main Street, its windows like suspicious eyes. Caleb straightened his coat, pushed back his hat, and strode through the front door. The smell of old tobacco and wet wool filled the cramped office. Sheriff Mace lounged behind his desk, boots propped up, a tin star gleaming on his chest. His deputy dozed in the corner, rifle across his knees. "Well now," Mace drawled, "if it ain't the Hermit of Hollow Creek, what brings you to civilization, Booker?" "Sarah Greyhawk," Caleb said evenly. "I'm here to post her bail." Mace's boots hit the floor with a thud. "Ain't no bail being set. That squaw's held for disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, and trespassing on county land. That land belongs to her, legal and proper." Caleb's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Where is she?" "Back cell." Mace jerked his thumb toward the corridor. "And there she'll stay till the railroad boys sort out this water rights business." Caleb turned without another word, heading for Judge Doan's office across the street. The morning cold had nothing on the ice in his veins. He found Alfred Doan hunched over his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose. The judge startled when Caleb entered, nearly knocking over an ink pot. "Mr. Booker, what brings you—" "Sarah Greyhawk's water deed," Caleb cut in. "The one granted by Cherokee Treaty. Ring any bells, Judge?" Doan's face went pale. He fumbled with his papers, refusing to meet Caleb's eyes. "Now see here, that's a complicated matter. The railroad has certain interests." "Interests that trump the law?" Caleb stepped closer. "Sarah showed that deed to Mace yesterday, before he tore it up and threw her in jail." "She what?" Doan's head snapped up. "The deed was destroyed?" "Along with any pretense of justice in this town." Caleb planted both hands on the judge's desk, leaning forward. "Sarah's children are in my wagon, beaten and scared. Their mother's in a cell for defending her legal rights. What are you going to do about it, Your Honor?" The judge tugged at his collar, sweat beading on his forehead despite the winter chill. Years of compromise showed in the lines of his face, in the way his hands shook as he reached for his water glass. Judge Doan glanced toward his office window, then lowered his voice. "Not here. Come to my parlor. We'll speak privately." Caleb followed the judge through the bitter cold to a modest house 3 doors down. Inside, dark wood panels and heavy curtains wrapped the room in shadows, despite the morning light. A fire crackled in the hearth, fighting back the winter chill. "Whiskey?" Doan's hands trembled as he poured 2 glasses. "You'll understand why once I explain." Caleb accepted the drink but remained standing. "I'm listening." The judge sank into his leather armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. "The water spring that feeds Red Willow Crossing, it lies within the boundaries of Sarah's land grant. According to the original treaty map, her claim is ironclad. The railroad men know this. They discovered it last month." Doan took a long swallow of whiskey. "Agent Greeley made it clear my position would become difficult if I didn't help clear the way for their plans." "And Sarah's deed?" "The original treaty map proves her claim. Without it." Doan's voice trailed off. "Where is it?" The judge stared into his glass. "My office safe. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it, even when Greeley insisted." "Show me." Back in his office, Doan dismissed his clerk with shaking hands. The safe stood in the corner, its black iron face unassuming. The judge worked the combination slowly, each click echoing in the quiet room. Inside, beneath stacks of legal papers, lay a yellowed map marked with careful ink lines and Cherokee symbols. Doan spread it across his desk with reverent hands. "Here," he pointed to a curved line. "The spring lies within these boundaries. The treaty granted water rights to Sarah's grandfather's people. When she married James Greyhawk, the deed passed to their household." Caleb studied the document, memorizing every detail. This is her leverage. The railroad can't build without water access. Precisely why they're so desperate to void her claim. Doan's voice dropped to a whisper. Greeley's men won't stop at jail cells, Caleb. They mean to drive her out, one way or another. The winter sun was setting by the time Caleb returned to his wagon. David and Ruthie huddled together under the blankets, their faces pinched with worry. "Let's get you somewhere warm," he said, helping them down. "I know just the place." Widow Malone's boarding house stood 3 stories tall, its windows glowing with lamplight. The smell of baking bread wafted from the kitchen as Caleb knocked on the back door. Elsa Malone answered, her gray hair neat beneath a white cap, her apron dusted with flour. Her stern expression softened at the sight of the children. "Land sakes," she breathed. "Sarah's little ones? Come in before you freeze." She ushered them into the warm kitchen, already moving to heat milk on the cook stove. "I heard about Sarah's arrest. Shameful business." Her sharp eyes took in the children's bruises. "Who laid hands on these babies?" "Sheriff's men," Caleb said quietly. "When they took their mama." Widow Malone's mouth set in a hard line. "Well now, we'll see about that." She placed steaming cups before the children. "Drink up, dears. You're safe here." David wrapped his hands around the warm cup but didn't drink. "When can we see Mama?" "Soon," Caleb promised. "But first we need to get cleaned up for church tomorrow." "Church?" Ruthie's voice quavered. "But Mama always takes us—" "And she will again," Widow Malone said firmly. "But tomorrow you'll sit with me. Show those fine folk what kind of children Sarah Greyhawk raises." She shot Caleb a meaningful look. "Sunday service brings out everyone who's anyone in Red Willow Crossing, including certain railroad men who need reminding of Christian charity." Caleb nodded, understanding her intent. The children would be living proof of the sheriff's brutality, their presence a silent accusation before God and community. "You'll watch over them?" he asked. "Like they were my own." Widow Malone's voice held steel beneath its gentleness. "I nursed their father through his final days. I'll not fail his children now." She showed them to a small room upstairs, its twin beds covered in patchwork quilts. As she helped Ruthie wash up, Caleb pulled David aside. "Your mama's counting on you to be strong one more night," he said softly. "Can you do that? Watch over your sister?" David straightened his shoulders, chin lifting in a way that echoed Sarah's quiet dignity. "Yes, sir. I promise." Caleb touched the boy's shoulder gently. "You're a good son, David. Your mama's proud of you. Both of you." Later, as Caleb prepared to leave, Widow Malone caught his arm. "That treaty map," she whispered. "Did Doan still have it?" "You knew?" "Sarah showed me once. Said it was her children's future, written in ink and paper." "It still exists," Caleb confirmed. "And tomorrow the whole town's going to learn what kind of justice we really have in Red Willow Crossing." The winter dawn painted Red Willow's sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. Caleb stood before his cracked mirror, straightening the collar of his one good shirt. The treaty map lay carefully rolled on his bed, its yellowed edges protected by a length of oilcloth. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of tying his string tie as memories of Sarah's kindness flooded back. Her gentle hands tending his fever 2 winters past, her quiet strength when facing down the railroad men. First Light Church's bell rang clear across the frozen morning, calling the faithful to worship. Caleb tucked the map inside his coat and stepped out into the biting cold. His boots crunched through fresh snow as he made his way down Main Street. The church stood proud against the morning sky, its white-painted boards gleaming. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over the gathered congregation. Widow Malone sat near the front, David and Ruthie pressed close on either side. Their clean faces and combed hair couldn't quite hide the fading bruises, but they held their heads high, just like their mother would. Pastor Kane stood at his pulpit, thin shoulders bent beneath his black coat. His quiet voice barely reached the back pews as he opened his Bible to begin the service. "Today's lesson speaks of humility," he said, eyes downcast, "of knowing our place before God and man." Caleb's hand pressed against the map hidden in his coat. The pastor's words about humility struck him as hollow, given what lay in his pocket. He rose slowly to his feet. "Begging your pardon, Pastor Kane," Caleb's voice carried clear through the church. "But sometimes the Lord calls us to speak truth, not stay humble and silent." A rustle of whispers swept through the pews. Widow Malone's chin lifted slightly, her eyes bright with approval. Pastor Kane blinked rapidly, his sermon forgotten. Caleb strode to the front of the church, withdrawing the map. The oilcloth wrapping fell away as he unrolled it across the altar rail. "This here's a treaty map," he announced. "Shows the legal boundaries of Sarah Greyhawk's land grant. Land that includes the spring that feeds this whole town." The whispers grew louder. Judge Doan, seated in the second row, seemed to shrink into his coat. "The Cherokee were promised these water rights," Caleb continued, his finger tracing the careful ink lines. "Sarah's grandfather's mark is right here, alongside the government agent's seal. This deed passed legal-like to Sarah when she married James Greyhawk." The church door banged open. Sheriff Mace stood in the doorway, winter wind swirling snow around his boots. "Now see here," he growled, stalking down the aisle. "You can't trust anything this drunken squatter says. He's living in a line shack, for heaven's sake." "Caleb Booker's word is good as gold," Widow Malone's voice rang out. She rose to her feet, straight-backed and stern. "He nursed my Ernest's cattle through the blue tongue outbreak 4 years back. Wouldn't take a penny for his trouble." "That's right," Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith, spoke up. "Fixed my press wheel last spring, did it proper too." More voices joined in, each with a story of Caleb's quiet help over the years. The sheriff's face darkened as his dismissal backfired. Pastor Kane cleared his throat. Perhaps we should examine this document more closely." His voice grew stronger. "If injustice has been done, we are called to make it right." Townsfolk began leaving their pews, gathering around the map. Questions flew thick and fast. "Is that really the government seal? Look here, these boundaries are clear as day." "But the railroad needs that water." Through it all, David and Ruthie sat quietly beside Widow Malone, their eyes fixed on Caleb with a mix of hope and fear. Sheriff Mace pushed through the crowd, leaning close to Caleb's ear. "Think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed. "This little stunt just painted a target on Sarah's back. Railroad money runs deeper than you know." Caleb met his gaze steadily. "The truth runs deeper still." The sheriff's hand dropped to his gun belt. "We'll see about that." He turned on his heel and stalked out, leaving the church door swinging in the winter wind. The congregation's curious murmurs continued, though few dared speak openly against the sheriff or railroad interests. Fear kept their voices low, but their eyes told a different story as they studied the map and whispered among themselves. Pastor Kane's trembling hands smoothed the map's corners. Let us take this matter to prayer," he suggested, though his eyes held a new spark of resolve beneath their usual uncertainty. Widow Malone gathered David and Ruthie closer, her expression fierce and protective as she watched the townspeople cluster around the evidence of their mother's claim. The truth was out now, for better or worse, and Red Willow Crossing would have to choose which side of justice they stood on. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Red Willow's snow-covered pastures as Caleb guided his horse toward the cluster of smaller ranches east of town. His first stop was Eli Carter's modest spread, where smoke curled from the chimney of a weathered cabin. Eli emerged at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. a tired young man with a baby bundled against his chest. Dark circles beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless nights with his newborn daughter. "Afternoon, Eli," Caleb called softly, mindful of the sleeping infant. He dismounted, leading his horse to the fence. "Reckon we need to talk about the spring." Eli's expression tightened. "Heard about your church presentation. Sheriff's been by already, warning us not to listen to troublemakers." "That right?" Caleb leaned against the fence post. "Did he mention what the railroad plans to charge for water rights once they take control?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Eli shifted his daughter to his other shoulder, brow furrowed. "Charge us? But we've always had free access to that spring." "Railroad don't care about tradition," Caleb said. "They care about profit. Sarah Greyhawk's deed might seem like a threat now, but think on this. She's lived here 15 years, never once denied water to a neighbor in need." The baby stirred, and Eli bounced her gently. "Martha worries about having enough water for the garden come spring. With the little one now—" He trailed off, looking toward his small herd of cattle in the distance. "That's why I'm here," Caleb said. "Sarah's willing to put agreements in writing. Fair terms for all the ranchers. But we need folks willing to stand with her against Mace and his railroad friends." Eli was quiet for a long moment, just rocking his daughter. "Let me talk to Martha," he said finally. "Maybe we could come to that supper meeting you're planning." Word spread quickly among the scattered ranches. Caleb rode from homestead to homestead as the afternoon wore on, having similar conversations with other young families trying to scratch out a living from the unforgiving land. By the time the sun touched the western hills, he had secured promises from 5 ranchers to attend an evening meeting at Pastor Kane's house. The mood was different when Caleb returned to Widow Malone's boarding house. Sweet sounds drifted from the parlor, Ruthie's clear voice leading a small group of children in amazing grace. The widow had gathered several youngsters from neighboring families, and they sat in a circle around Ruthie as she taught them the verses. David stood apart, arms crossed, watching from the doorway. His young face was set in determined lines that reminded Caleb painfully of Sarah. "You doing all right, son?" Caleb asked quietly. "I should be helping Mama," David said, his voice tight. "Not singing songs while she's in that jail. I can protect her myself. I'm strong enough." Caleb placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your mom is counting on you to look after Ruthie right now. That's protecting her too, you understand?" David's shoulders slumped slightly. "Yes, sir, but I still don't like it." "None of us do," Caleb agreed. "But things are moving. Got some folks coming to talk tonight who might help make a difference." In the parlor, Ruthie started another hymn, her voice rising pure and clear above the others. The simple melody seemed to ease some of the tension from David's stance. As evening approached, Widow Malone shooed the visiting children home and prepared a hearty supper of bean soup and cornbread. The aroma filled the house as ranchers began arriving at Pastor Kane's nearby home, stamping snow from their boots on his porch. "Smells mighty fine," Eli Carter said, as his wife Martha carried their sleeping baby inside. 4 other young ranching couples followed, along with Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith who'd spoken up in church. Pastor Kane welcomed them nervously, his thin hands fluttering as he directed everyone to seats around his worn dining table. The room was crowded but warm, lit by oil lamps that cast a gentle glow over worried faces. "Before we begin," Caleb said, standing at the head of the table, "I want you all to know what's at stake. This ain't just about Sarah Greyhawk's rights, though those are worth fighting for. This is about all our futures in Red Willow Crossing." He laid out the situation plainly, the railroad's plans, the likely fees for water access, the strength of Sarah's legal claim. As he spoke, he saw understanding dawn in their eyes. These weren't wealthy ranchers who could afford to pay whatever the railroad demanded. They were families trying to build something lasting, just like Sarah. "What exactly are you asking of us?" Martha Carter asked, cradling her baby close. "Stand with us," Pastor Kane said, his quiet voice stronger than usual. Bear witness to the truth of Sarah's claim. Show Sheriff Mace and the railroad that this town won't be bullied into giving up what's right." A murmur of discussion rose around the table. Caleb watched hope kindle in their faces as they began to see Sarah's water rights not as a threat, but as protection against corporate greed. It wasn't complete victory, but it was a start, the first flames of grassroots support taking hold in fertile ground. Back at Widow Malone's boarding house, the large oak table groaned under platters of steaming cornbread, beans, and roasted vegetables. The warm glow of oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls as Caleb, Pastor Kane, and the 5 ranching families gathered around for supper. "Seems to me," Tom Wheeler said, breaking a piece of cornbread, "that if Sarah Greyhawk's got legal rights to that spring, we ought to be grateful. Better her than some railroad man who never worked a day on frontier soil." Widow Malone stood at the head of the table, her gray hair neatly pinned back, her stern face softening as she ladled more bean soup into Martha Carter's bowl. "You all seem to have short memories," she said, her voice carrying that mix of warmth and steel that commanded attention. "How many of you were here 3 winters ago, during that terrible influenza outbreak?" The room grew quiet except for the soft crackle of the fireplace. Pastor Kane shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I remember clear as day," the widow continued, moving around the table. "Sarah Greyhawk rode out day and night, through snow and ice, tending to sick folks, Indian and white alike. Didn't matter to her. She was the only one who knew the healing herbs that saved so many." She paused behind Pastor Kane's chair, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Including your niece Emma, Pastor. Remember how Sarah stayed 3 days straight at your brother's place, nursing that child through fever? Never asked for a penny in return." The pastor's thin face flushed red. "Yes," he said softly. "Emma would not be with us today if not for Sarah's knowledge and care." "And you, Martha Carter," Widow Malone continued, gesturing to the young mother. "Who was it helped bring your little one into the world just last month?" Martha hugged her sleeping infant closer. "Sarah did. She knew exactly what to do when the cord was wrapped wrong. The doctor was 2 towns away, but Sarah, she saved us both." Eli Carter reached for his wife's hand, his face troubled. "We've been mighty short-sighted, haven't we? Acting like Sarah's claim to the spring is some kind of threat, when she's never been anything but a blessing to this community." "That railroad agent Greeley, he was at my place yesterday," young rancher James Foster spoke up, "talking about reasonable fees for water access once they take control, but his eyes were cold as a rattler's. We all know there won't be anything reasonable about it." Caleb leaned forward, his voice steady. "Sarah's legal claim could protect all of us. She's willing to put fair agreements in writing, guarantee water rights for every ranch family at rates we can afford. But first, we need to get her out of that jail and stop Mace from forcing her off her land." "What can we do?" Tom Wheeler asked, setting down his fork. "Sheriff's got the law behind him, or at least he claims to." Pastor Kane cleared his throat. "Not if we stand together. This Sunday, I propose we make a public declaration of support, the whole congregation bearing witness to Sarah's rightful claim and her years of service to this community." "It'll take courage," Caleb added. "Mace won't like it, but if enough of us speak up—" "I'll stand," Martha Carter said firmly, surprising her husband. "I owe Sarah my life and my baby's life. It's time I showed some backbone in return." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. The widow watched with satisfaction as the alliance took shape around her dinner table, years of prejudice and fear giving way to something stronger, a sense of shared purpose and justice. As the evening wore on, David and Ruthie peeked around the doorframe, their young faces anxious but hopeful. Caleb noticed them and excused himself from the table. "Time for bed, you two," he said gently, guiding them toward the stairs. "It's been a long day." "Did they decide to help Mama?" David asked, his dark eyes serious. "They did," Caleb assured him, helping Ruthie with the buttons on her worn coat. We're going to make things right. Get your mama home where she belongs." "Promise?" Ruthie's small voice trembled. Caleb knelt down to her level. "I promise you'll see her soon. Now up those stairs and into bed. Widow Malone won't take kindly to any dawdling." The children climbed the creaking stairs, and Caleb watched until they disappeared into their room. When he turned back toward the dining room, he caught Widow Malone's knowing look. "Those children have wormed their way into your heart, haven't they?" she asked softly. Before Caleb could answer, a shadow passed across the front window, just a flicker in the lamplight, but enough to make him tense. He moved quietly to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure slipping between the buildings across the street, but the night shadows played tricks on tired eyes. Still, something in his gut told him Sheriff Mace wouldn't take this growing resistance lightly. The thought of what tomorrow might bring settled like a weight in his chest as he returned to the warmth of the dining room, where hope and determination had finally taken root. The bitter dawn light revealed a piece of paper nailed to Widow Malone's front door, fluttering in the morning breeze. Caleb stood on the porch, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air as he read the crude message scratched in charcoal. "Leave Cherokee business to Cherokee graves." He yanked the note free, crumpling it in his fist. The threat didn't shake him. He'd faced worse during his years riding fence lines. What troubled him was the cowardice behind it, the darkness that turned neighbors against each other. Inside, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the kitchen. David and Ruthie sat at the table, their faces brightening when Caleb entered. "We're going to see your mama today," he announced, tucking the threatening note into his pocket before the children could spot it. Widow Malone caught his eye from her place at the stove. She'd seen the note herself earlier. He could tell by the tight set of her mouth and the extra portions she heaped onto the children's plates. The jail stood cold and gray in the morning light. Sheriff Mace's deputy, a young man with nervous hands, led them down the row of cells. Sarah sat on a thin cot in the last cell, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Despite 5 days of confinement, she held herself with quiet dignity. "Mama," Ruthie pressed against the iron bars, reaching through with her small hands. Sarah moved quickly to the bars, gathering her daughter's fingers in her own. "My precious ones," she whispered, touching David's cheek through the bars. "Are you being good for Mr. Booker?" "Yes, Mama," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Widow Malone's teaching us hymns, and Mr. Booker let me help feed his horse yesterday." Sarah's eyes met Caleb's over the children's heads. Though her face was pale and drawn, her gaze held steady strength. "Thank you," she said softly. "The town's starting to wake up," Caleb told her. "Pastor Kane and some of the ranchers are standing with us now. We're preparing for the hearing." Sarah nodded, then spoke with quiet intensity. "Stand louder than the hate, Caleb. That's what my father always said. The truth needs strong voices." The deputy shuffled uncomfortably. "Time's about up, folks." Sarah pressed her forehead to the bars, speaking quickly to her children. "Be brave, my little ones. Listen to Mr. Booker and Widow Malone. I'll be home soon." Ruthie began to cry as Caleb led them away. The sound echoed off the stone walls, a child's grief too big for such a cold place. Outside, they found Pastor Kane waiting by the wagon. His thin face was pinched with concern as he helped lift the children into the back. "The railroad's lawyers arrived on the morning stage," he said in low tones to Caleb. 3 of them, all wearing city suits and carrying leather briefcases. They've taken rooms at the hotel. Caleb clicked his tongue at the mule. "Then we'd better make sure we're ready for them. Come by this evening. We need to plan." Dark clouds gathered throughout the afternoon, heavy with the promise of snow. By sunset, when Pastor Kane arrived at Widow Malone's, the first flakes were already falling. They gathered in the parlor, spreading papers across a small table while the children played checkers by the fire. Widow Malone brought coffee and her special apple cake, though her hospitality didn't extend to the railroad men in town. "Vultures in fancy coats," she muttered, setting down the plates with more force than necessary. "I've written down everything I remember about Sarah's care for the townsfolk," Pastor Kane said, smoothing out several sheets of paper. "Dates, names, lives saved. Martha Carter signed her account of the difficult birth last month." "Good," Caleb nodded. "We'll need more. Every ranch family who depends on that spring water. Every person Sarah's helped with her medicines." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. The blizzard moved in fast, as winter storms often did on the frontier. Soon the air was thick with whirling snow, and the temperature plummeted. "No one's going anywhere tonight," Widow Malone declared, stoking the fire. "Might as well put the time to good use." Through the long evening, they worked on affidavits, sworn statements from townspeople testifying to Sarah's character and her vital role in the community. Pastor Kane's careful handwriting filled page after page, while Caleb recounted the details of the water deed and treaty map. David and Ruthie eventually fell asleep on the settee, wrapped in quilts. Watching them, Caleb felt his resolve strengthen. The threatening note in his pocket, the railroad lawyers in town, the storm howling outside. None of it would stop him from keeping his promise to these children and their mother. "The blizzard's a blessing in disguise," Pastor Kane observed, flexing his cramped writing hand. "Buys us time to gather more support before the hearing." Caleb agreed, though his thoughts were still in that jail cell, with Sarah's quiet words about standing louder than hate. He would do more than stand. He would make sure justice echoed through every corner of Red Willow Crossing until even the most hardened hearts had to listen. The blizzard wrapped Red Willow Crossing in a thick white blanket, forcing everyone to huddle indoors. At Widow Malone's boarding house, the parlor became a makeshift war room. Papers scattered across every surface as Caleb, Pastor Kane, and the widow worked to gather written testimonies supporting Sarah's claim. "Here's another one," David said, carefully copying Mrs. Carter's letter about how Sarah had saved her baby during a difficult birth. His small hand moved slowly across the paper, each letter formed with determination. "Mama always said writing clear is important as speaking clear." Ruthie sat cross-legged by the fire, sorting through the growing pile of statements. Though only 7 years old, she insisted on helping, matching similar stories together with careful precision. Widow Malone watched the children from her rocking chair, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "Those two have their mama's spirit, sure enough, careful and thorough in everything they do." Caleb nodded, pausing in his own writing to flex his cramped fingers. The sight of David's intense concentration reminded him of another determined soul from his past. "My Rebecca was like that too," he said softly, surprising himself by speaking of his late wife. "Could spend hours getting every detail just right in her garden ledger." David looked up, curiosity brightening his eyes. "Was she a healer like Mama?" "No, but she had a way with growing things." Caleb smiled at the memory. "Could make anything bloom, even in the driest summer. She'd share her vegetables with anyone who needed them, just like your mama shares her medicine." Ruthie abandoned her sorting to settle near Caleb's feet. "Tell us more about Miss Rebecca," she urged, her small face earnest. Pastor Kane and Widow Malone exchanged knowing glances as Caleb set aside his pen. The children had worked hard all morning. They deserved a break, and perhaps he needed one too. "Well," he began, leaning back in his chair. "Rebecca had this saying about stubborn plants. Said sometimes the ones that have to fight hardest to grow end up being the strongest. Reminded me of that when I first met your mama, standing up to Sheriff Mace all by herself." "Mama says being strong doesn't mean being alone," David offered, setting down his pen. "Says we're stronger together, like tree roots holding each other up." "Your mama's right about that," Widow Malone interjected. Her knitting paused. "And that's exactly what these letters show. How we're all connected, how we need each other." They worked through the afternoon, breaking only for Widow Malone's hearty stew and cornbread. The children's presence softened something in Caleb he hadn't realized had grown hard. Their questions about Rebecca opened memories he'd kept locked away, and sharing them felt like opening windows in a dusty room. As evening approached, the howling wind began to ease. Through the frosted windows, they could see the snow settling into drifts taller than Ruthie. The forced isolation had given them precious time to prepare, but it had given them something else too, a chance to become more than strangers thrown together by circumstance. "Look at this stack," Pastor Kane said proudly, gathering the day's work into neat piles. 23 statements, all speaking to Sarah's character and her legal right to the spring. Even old Mr. Peterson wrote about how she saved his leg last winter when everyone else said it needed cutting off. The quiet moment was interrupted by urgent knocking. It was young Tommy from the telegraph office, his coat crusted with snow. "Message came through before the lines went down," he panted, handing a yellow paper to Caleb. "Thought you ought to know right away." Caleb read the telegram aloud. "Railroad agent Thomas Greeley departing Kansas City. Stop arriving Red Willow crossing by Weeks. End stop. Prepare documentation for review stop." The room fell silent. Even the children sensed the shift in mood, drawing closer together near the fire. "A week isn't much time," Pastor Kane said quietly. "It's enough," Caleb replied, his voice firm. He looked at David and Ruthie, seeing their mother's quiet strength in their faces. "We've got truth on our side, and a whole town's worth of witnesses to back it up." Widow Malone rose from her chair, her expression determined. "Well then, we'd better make sure every one of these statements is copied clean and proper. Can't have some fancy railroad man thinking we're just simple folk who don't know our rights." David picked up his pen again, shoulders straight. "I'll help. Mama always says anything worth doing is worth doing right." Ruthie gathered her sorted piles, bringing them to the table. "Me too. We gotta help Mama come home." Caleb watched them work in the lamplight. These children who'd traveled through snow to find him, who'd trusted him with their safety and their mother's future. They'd given him something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to fight, to care, to believe in justice again. The telegram lay on the table, its stark message a reminder of the challenge ahead. But looking at the stacks of testimonies, at the children's determined faces, at Pastor Kane's quiet resolve and Widow Malone's fierce protectiveness, Caleb knew they were ready. Sarah's fight had become their fight, and together they would stand louder than any hate. The morning sun glinted off snow-piled shoulder-high along Red Willow's main street. Men with shovels carved narrow paths between buildings, while women swept drifts from porches. The whole town looked like a white maze, with only the church steeple rising clear above the drifts. Caleb and Pastor Kane trudged through the freshly cleared path toward Judge Doan's office, their boots crunching in the packed snow. Each carried a leather portfolio stuffed with affidavits, 23 testimonies speaking to Sarah's character and legal claim. "Lord willing, these will open his eyes," Kane said, adjusting his grip on the documents. The judge's clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, showed them into Doan's private chamber. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and dusty law books. Judge Doan sat behind his massive oak desk, looking smaller than usual, his face drawn with worry. "More trouble, I suppose?" Doan asked, not meeting their eyes. Caleb laid the portfolios on the desk with a solid thump. "Not trouble, Judge. Truth. 23 sworn statements from God-fearing citizens testifying to Sarah Greyhawk's right to that spring." Doan's hands trembled slightly as he opened the first folder. His eyes skimmed the neat rows of signatures, each one a respected name in Red Willow Crossing. "This won't stop the railroad," he muttered. "They'll bring lawyers, throw around big words and bigger threats." "Like they did in Mexico?" Caleb's voice cut sharp as a knife. "Remember Buena Vista, Judge? You were there. We both were." Doan's head snapped up, color rising in his pale cheeks. "That was different." "Was it?" Caleb leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk. "We fought for freedom then, for justice. When did you stop believing in those things? I have responsibilities, Doan protested. A position to maintain. And what good is that position if you use it to help the strong crush the weak? Pastor Kane's quiet voice carried more weight than thunder. What does your conscience say, Judge? Doan stood abruptly, pacing to his window. Outside, townspeople continued clearing snow, working together, helping neighbors. He watched them for a long moment. We swore an oath, Caleb pressed, both as soldiers and as men of the law, to protect the innocent, to stand for what's right. The judge's shoulders sagged. When he turned back, something had shifted in his face. Saturday, he said, I'll call an emergency congregation meeting. Let everyone hear the evidence, speak their piece. That's all we ask, Caleb nodded. A fair hearing in the light of day. They left the judge's office into bright afternoon sunlight. Word of Saturday's meeting spread quickly through town, carried on excited whispers from porch to porch. But not all the whispers were friendly. Sheriff Mace stood outside the saloon, talking low with 3 rough-looking men Caleb had never seen before. Their clothes were trail-worn, their gun belts riding low, hired muscle clear as day. As Caleb passed, Mace called out with false cheer. Making trouble again, Booker? Just doing what's right, Sheriff. You ought to try it sometime. The 3 strangers watched him with cold eyes, hands never far from their weapons. Message received. Mace was building his own army. That evening, after helping Widow Malone secure the house for night, Caleb pulled on his heavy coat. David looked up from his reading by the fire. Where are you going, Mr. Caleb? Just checking on things, son. Get some sleep now. Widow Malone met him at the door, her face worried. Those men Mace brought in, they've been watching the house. I know. Caleb checked his revolver, making sure it moved smooth in its holster. That's why I'm watching them back. The widow squeezed his arm. Be careful. Those children need you whole. Snow crunched under Caleb's boots as he walked his patrol route. The moon cast blue shadows between buildings, perfect hiding spots for men with ill intent. But Caleb knew every alley, every corner of Red Willow. He'd fought in worse places, against worse odds. He spotted one of Mace's men lurking near the church, another watching from the saloon's 2nd floor. Let them watch. Let them see that threats wouldn't work, that good people standing together were stronger than any hired gun. Through the long night hours, Caleb kept his vigil. His breath frosted in the cold air as he circled the widow's house again and again. Inside, 2 children slept safe and warm. Their mother sat in a cold cell, waiting for justice. Come Saturday, God willing, that justice would finally arrive. The night grew deeper, stars sharp as icicles in the clear sky. Caleb's feet were numb, his fingers stiff around his rifle, but he didn't stop his rounds. Too much depended on keeping everyone safe until Saturday. Too many good people had finally found their courage to speak up. He wouldn't let Mace's intimidation tactics silence them now. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold over Red Willow Crossing. The church bell rang out across the snow-covered town, calling people to gather for the emergency meeting. They came in 2s and 3s, boots crunching through fresh snow, breath steaming in the winter air. Caleb stood at the church steps with Pastor Kane, watching the crowd file in. Sarah's supporters nodded grimly as they passed, the young ranchers, shopkeepers, and families whose lives she had touched. Railroad agent Thomas Greeley arrived with 3 suited lawyers, their city boots already soaked. Sheriff Mace positioned his hired men strategically around the church's perimeter, their presence a silent threat. Inside, the wooden pews creaked under the weight of the fullest congregation Red Willow had seen in years. Widow Malone sat with David and Ruthie in the front row, the children's faces solemn but hopeful. Judge Doan occupied his usual seat, fingers drumming nervously on his Bible. Pastor Kane approached the pulpit as the last stragglers found their places. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting rainbow patterns across his weathered face. He opened his Bible with deliberate care. "Brothers and sisters," Cain began, his quiet voice carrying to every corner, "today we speak of justice, not the justice of men's laws alone, but God's justice, which calls us to protect the widow, defend the innocent, and stand firm against wickedness." The pastor's words grew stronger as he continued. Courage isn't just facing danger. Sometimes courage means facing our own hearts, admitting when we've allowed fear to make us silent in the face of wrong. His eyes swept across familiar faces. "I confess, I stayed silent too long. We all have." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Cain gestured to Caleb. "But today, we have a chance to make that right. Mr. Booker will show us how." Caleb rose, treaty map and affidavits clutched carefully in his calloused hands. He walked to the front, boots echoing on wooden floorboards. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at his neighbors' faces. "Ain't much for fancy speeches," he began, "but I know right from wrong. This here's a map showing Sarah Greyhawk's legal claim to Red Willow's spring. It's signed by federal authorities, witnessed proper, and recorded in territorial books." He unrolled the yellowed document, holding it up for all to see. "Some folks say a Cherokee woman can't own such important water rights. But I say any woman who's delivered half the babies in this town, tended our sick, and asked nothing in return has earned her place here." Sheriff Mace shifted in his seat, face darkening. The railroad lawyers whispered among themselves. "Got 23 sworn statements here." Caleb patted the stack of affidavits. "From folks testifying to Sarah's character and her legal right to that spring. Good people, your neighbors, speaking truth before God and man." Widow Malone stood suddenly, her voice ringing clear and strong. "I watched Sarah nurse my Henry through his final fever. Stayed up 3 nights straight, using her Cherokee medicines when nothing else worked." She turned to face the congregation. "When the Miller twins were born breech last spring, she saved both babies and their mama. Never asked a penny, though God knows they couldn't pay." More voices joined in, sharing stories of Sarah's kindness and skill. Each testimony built on the last, painting a picture of a woman who had woven herself into the community's very fabric. Sheriff Mace surged to his feet. "This is sedition," he shouted. "She's stirring up trouble, turning good Christians against progress. That spring belongs to the territory now." "Does it?" Caleb's voice cut through the rising noise. He opened his Bible to a marked page. Proverbs 23, verse 10. "Remove not the ancient landmark, nor enter the fields of the fatherless." His eyes locked with Mace's. "That spring's been Cherokee land since before any of us came here. Taking it now ain't progress, it's theft." "Amen," someone called. Others nodded, the mood in the church shifting like wind before a storm. "And what of Exodus 23?" Caleb continued. "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Just because powerful men want something, don't make taking it right." The railroad lawyers shuffled uncomfortably. Even their practiced arguments seemed to wither under the weight of simple truth spoken plainly. Judge Doan stood, commanding attention. "I've reviewed the evidence. The treaty map is genuine. The water rights are legally Sarah's." He paused, gathering courage. "She'll be released from jail today, with my personal apology." A cheer went up from Sarah's supporters. Sheriff Mace stormed out, his hired men trailing behind like shadows fleeing sunlight. The railroad men huddled with their lawyers, faces grim as they realized their easy victory had evaporated. David and Ruthie hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Widow Malone gathered them close, her own eyes shining. Pastor Cain raised his hands for quiet. "Let us pray," he said, "and thank God for opening our hearts to justice." The congregation bowed their heads, but Caleb kept his eyes open, watching sunlight stream through the windows, turning ordinary glass into something holy. Sometimes, he reckoned, that's exactly what justice did, transformed the everyday into something sacred. The church doors burst open, letting in a blast of winter air. Judge Doan stood at the front, his spine finally straight after years of bending to others' will. He held the treaty map reverently, like a sacred text. "By the authority vested in me by the territory," Doan proclaimed, his voice stronger than anyone had heard in years, "I hereby declare Sarah Greyhawk's water deed legitimate and binding." He turned to face Sheriff Mace directly. "Furthermore, I order her immediate release from custody, all charges dismissed." The congregation erupted in cheers. Widow Malone pulled David and Ruthie close, their faces shining with joyful tears. Pastor Kane bowed his head in quiet prayer, while the young ranchers clapped each other's backs. Sheriff Mace's face twisted with rage. His hand twitched near his gun belt as he glared at Judge Doan. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "The only mistake," Doan replied evenly, "was letting fear keep me silent this long." He held out an official release document. "Now do your duty, Sheriff." The crowd parted as Caleb led David and Ruthie toward the jail, their boots crunching through fresh snow. Townspeople followed, forming a determined procession down Main Street. The morning sun caught the frost on bare tree branches, making them sparkle like diamonds. At the jailhouse door, Sheriff Mace fumbled with his keys, face red with barely contained fury. The lock clicked, and the iron door swung open with a mournful creak. Sarah Greyhawk emerged slowly, squinting in the bright light. Her dark hair was tangled, and her dress was wrinkled from days in the cell, but her eyes held the same quiet dignity they always had. David and Ruthie broke free from the crowd, running to throw their arms around her waist. "Mama!" they cried in unison. Sarah knelt, gathering her children close. "My brave ones," she whispered, pressing kisses to their faces. "Did you stay strong?" "Mr. Booker helped us," David said proudly. "He showed everyone the truth." Sarah looked up at Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude. Before she could speak, cheers erupted from the gathered townspeople. Widow Malone stepped forward with a warm shawl, wrapping it around Sarah's shoulders. Other women pressed forward with offers of fresh clothes and hot meals. But the celebration froze as the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning air. A sleek black horse carried a well-dressed man down Main Street, his polished boots and crisp suit marking him as an outsider. Behind him rode two armed marshals, their badges catching the sunlight. The rider dismounted smoothly, adjusting his silk tie. "I am Thomas Greeley, representing the Western Railroad Corporation." His voice was cultured, almost pleasant, but his eyes were cold. "I have here a federal warrant for the arrest of Sarah Greyhawk on charges of deed fraud and conspiracy against railroad interests." The crowd's joy evaporated like morning mist. Sarah pulled her children closer as Greeley produced an official-looking document with a federal seal. "This warrant," Greeley continued, "signed by the territorial governor himself, authorizes immediate arrest and transport to the federal courthouse in St. Louis for trial." He smiled thinly. "The penalty for such fraud can be quite severe." Sheriff Mace's smirk returned as he stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs. "Looks like justice will be served after all." The air grew thick with tension. David clutched his mother's skirts, while Ruthie began to softly cry. The townspeople shifted uneasily, caught between their desire to help and their fear of federal authority. Caleb moved to stand between Sarah and the lawmen, his voice low but carrying clearly in the frozen morning air. "That warrant based on railroad company claims?" "The Western Railroad Corporation has submitted substantial evidence," Greeley replied smoothly. "The federal courts will determine its validity." "Meaning they'll lock her away until the railroad's built right through her land," Caleb translated grimly. The gathered townsfolk murmured angrily at this naked truth. Sheriff Mace's hand rested on his gun belt, his face split by a triumphant grin. The marshals spread out, hands near their weapons, while Greeley maintained his facade of civilized procedure. The morning sun seemed to dim, as though clouds had gathered, though the sky remained clear. Sarah stood tall despite her exhaustion, one hand on each child's shoulder. Her voice carried the strength of generations as she faced Greeley. "My grandfather signed that treaty in good faith. Our people have held that spring since before your railroad was even dreamed of." "Ancient history," Greeley dismissed with a wave. "Progress cannot be held hostage to outdated agreements. Sheriff, if you would proceed with the arrest?" The tension pulled tighter, like a rope about to snap. The children pressed closer to their mother, while the townspeople watched helplessly as federal authority prepared to override their local justice. In that frozen moment, the true scope of their fight became clear. It wasn't just about one spring or one family, but about whether power could simply erase what was right. Greeley nodded to the marshals. "Take her." As they moved forward, David and Ruthie's terrified screams split the winter air. "No, don't take Mama!" Their cries pierced through the crowd's hesitation like an arrow through ice. "Stop right there!" Widow Malone's voice cracked like a whip. She stepped forward, clutching a thick stack of papers to her chest. "Every soul here stands witness. We have 50 sworn affidavits testifying to Sarah's rightful claim and character." She thrust the documents toward Greeley. "Good Christians all, ready to testify in any court you choose." The crowd stirred, awakening like a giant from slumber. Eli Carter, the young rancher, moved first, positioning himself beside Sarah. Others followed: the shopkeeper, the blacksmith, 3 more ranchers. Pastor Kane stepped forward, Bible in hand, his quiet voice steady. "The Lord commands us to protect the widow and orphan," Kane declared. "We will not fail in this duty." More townspeople pressed in, forming a wall of humanity around Sarah and her children. Faces that had turned away in fear now showed resolve. Work-worn hands linked together, creating an unbreakable chain. Greeley's confident smile faltered. His eyes darted between the determined faces, calculating the cost of violence against this peaceful resistance. Such a scene would make ugly headlines back east. "This changes nothing legally," he said stiffly, backing toward his horse. "The warrant stands." "Then serve it properly, through the territorial court," Widow Malone shot back. "We'll all be there to speak truth." Sheriff Mace, seeing his victory slipping away, exploded in rage. His revolver cleared leather with a metallic snap. "Law's still law," he snarled. Caleb stepped into Mace's space, unarmed but radiating quiet strength. "Put it away, Mace. You ain't shooting mothers in front of their children. Not today. Not ever." Their eyes locked. Mace's hand trembled on the gun, but Caleb didn't flinch. The sheriff saw his own reflection in those steady eyes, saw what he'd become, and something broke inside him. The revolver lowered, then dropped into the snow. Deputy Sam Pritchard stood before the town council, his new badge gleaming in the lamplight. "First order of business is making things right," he announced, his young face set with determination. Sheriff Mace's actions violated both law and conscience. Judge Doan, chastened by recent events, nodded gravely. "Let the record show that James Mace is hereby stripped of his position as Sheriff of Red Willow Crossing, effective immediately." He turned to Pritchard. "Deputy, you'll serve as acting sheriff until proper elections can be held." Pritchard's voice carried across the packed meeting hall. "I aim to uphold justice with mercy, just like my pa taught me. Every citizen deserves fair treatment, regardless of their heritage." The town council, expanded now to include both settlers and Cherokee representatives, gathered around a long oak table. Papers rustled as they drafted what would become known as the Red Willow Charter. Widow Malone's steady hand recorded each carefully worded provision. "We hereby establish Red Willow Crossing as a shared stewardship community," Pastor Kane read aloud. "All families, regardless of heritage, shall have equal rights to land and water access." He paused, looking to Sarah. "With special protection for treaty-granted claims." When they offered Caleb a seat on the council, he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Much obliged," he said quietly. but I reckon I'm better suited to practical matters." Instead, he accepted the role of water distribution overseer, working alongside Sarah to ensure fair access to the spring. As evening settled over the valley, Sarah stood on her cabin porch, watching David and Ruthie chase fireflies in the yard. The weight of fear had lifted from their shoulders, replaced by the lightness of security and belonging. Caleb leaned against the porch rail, his presence a comfortable constant now. "Red Willow's changing," Sarah said softly, "in ways I never thought possible." "Reckon people just needed reminding of their better nature," Caleb replied, watching the children play. "Sometimes it takes a whole community standing together to find the right path." Inside the cabin, a lamp glowed warm and welcoming. For the first time in months, Sarah and her children were truly home, safe, free, and surrounded by neighbors who had chosen justice over fear. The warmth of dozens of oil lamps filled First Light Church, pushing back against the winter chill. Delicious aromas wafted through the air as Red Willow's families gathered for a Thanksgiving supper, celebrating their victory and newfound unity. In the church kitchen, Ruthie and David darted between flour-dusted counters, helping Widow Malone arrange her famous apple pies. "Careful with those crusts now," she instructed, but her stern tone couldn't hide her smile as Ruthie carefully placed cinnamon sugar dollops on each pie. Around the long tables, ranchers and townsfolk passed steaming platters of food, their voices mixing in animated conversation about their recent triumph. Eli Carter, the young rancher, described the moment they all stood together against the railroad agent. "Never seen anything like it," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Whole town just rose up as one." Caleb sat beside Sarah, their shoulders nearly touching as they shared a quiet moment amidst the celebration. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair as he turned to her. "Sometimes help ain't enough," he said softly, his voice carrying years of hard-earned wisdom. "You got to stand till folks can stand again." Sarah's eyes shone with understanding. "And you stood," she replied, "until we all could." Pastor Kane rose from his seat, tapping his glass for attention. "Before we conclude our evening," he announced, "let's lift our voices together." His gentle guidance led them into Amazing Grace, the beloved hymn filling every corner of the church with hope. Through the windows, lantern light spilled onto snow-covered streets, creating warm pools of golden light against the darkness. Caleb watched David and Ruthie playing tag between the pews, their laughter echoing off the wooden walls. Something settled in his chest, a feeling of belonging he'd forgotten during his years of solitude. The life he'd built in his line shack, far from people and their complications, seemed a distant memory now. In its place stood something far richer, a family not of blood, but of choice, a community bound together by courage and compassion. As David ran past, tagging his arm with a grin, Caleb realized he wouldn't have it any other way. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.